Part 1. The calm before the cannon fire. Hey guys. Tonight, we're drifting back to the seas. Not the clean, Instagram-filtered ones where you sip a coconut drink with a paper umbrella, but the grimy, salt-soaked world where people had wooden legs, suspicious rashes, and apparently thought eyeliner was a good intimidation tactic. So, get comfortable. Dim the lights. Maybe pour yourself some tea or just cocoon under the blanket. We're about to talk about pirates. And not the Disney kind. The real ones. Now, when people say pirates, most of us picture the Golden Age. You know, the early 1700s crew of swashbucklers with parrots, rum, and a shocking lack of dental care. But piracy has been around basically forever. The second humans figured out boats, someone else figured out, hey, what if I just steal their stuff? The Greeks had pirate. The Romans had pirate. Even Vikings were technically pirates, just with more fur and less rum. But the Golden Age of Piracy is usually narrowed down to about 1650 to 1730. A little stretch of time when the Caribbean, the American colonies, West Africa, and even parts of the Indian Ocean turned into one giant, chaotic pirate festival. Why did this happen? Well, as usual, it was Europe's fault. You had empires fighting each other non-stop. Spain, England, France, the Dutch, all clawing for overseas land and gold. Colonies kept popping up like badly thought-out franchises. And all those ships carrying gold, sugar, and slaves? Yeah. They were basically floating treasure chests, just begging to be robbed. But let's not rush into the fireworks yet. Before we get to Blackbeard and his fiery beard tricks, let's float through the background. The slow burn of how Europe basically created pirates, then pretended to be shocked when pirates showed up. So, picture the 1500s. Spain had just hit the jackpot with the Americas. Gold and silver poured in from mines in Mexico and Peru. Ships called galleons sailed back to Spain, stuffed to the brim with treasure. And you can guess what happened. Every other European power wanted some of that shiny loot. Enter the privateers. Basically, pirates with paperwork. A king or queen would hand you a license called a letter of marque, which was just a fancy way of saying, sure, go rob ships, as long as they belong to our enemies. And, please give us a cut. So you had English privateers like Sir Francis Drake. To Spain, he was a thief. To England, he was a sea dog, which honestly sounds like a bad football team mascot. He raided Spanish ports, stole treasure, circled the globe, and somehow got knighted for it. Imagine robbing trucks on the highway and then the government giving you a medal. And this worked for a while. Privateers gave their countries a nice, deniable way to mess with each other without technically declaring war. The Caribbean became this weird Wild West at sea. But then wars ended. Treaties got signed. Suddenly, all those privateers were out of a job. And, you can probably guess, they didn't exactly rush to become farmers. Once you've tasted gold bars and rum, plowing corn in Virginia doesn't quite have the same appeal. So, they did the logical thing. They kept pirating, just without the paperwork. Now, we need to pause here and acknowledge something. Piracy wasn't just some quirky side hustle. It was directly tied to the slave trade and colonialism. The Caribbean islands were basically sugar factories, run on brutal enslaved labor. Ships carrying enslaved Africans became prime pirate target. And here's where it gets messy. Some pirates freed enslaved people and welcomed them into their crews. Others just sold them for profit. So piracy had this odd, murky morality, half rebellion, half exploitation. But if we zoom out, the setup is clear. By the late 1600s you had disgruntled sailors, ex-privateers, and random outcasts with nowhere to go. Ships loaded with gold, sugar, tobacco, and human beings sailing across oceans, and colonial governments too far away, too underfunded, or frankly too lazy to patrol the seas. Recipe for chaos. Let's drift into the first hotspot, the Caribbean. The English had set up colonies in Jamaica and Barbados. The French grabbed Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti. And the Dutch, well, they took whatever wasn't nailed down. But Spain still claimed it owned basically all the Caribbean. Spoiler, it didn't. This is where the buccaneers appear. Now, the word buccaneer originally came from bucan, a method of slow-cooking meat on a wooden frame. Early hunters in Hispaniola, today's Haiti and Dominican Republic, used it. So yes, before buccaneer meant sea bandit, it basically meant guy who barbecues. But soon, these hunters got pushed off the land by Spanish colonists, so they turned to piracy instead. And the name stuck. So, the next time someone calls pirates fearsome buccaneers, just remember it started. These buccaneers gathered on Tortuga, a little island off Haiti, and turned it into a full-on pirate base. Tortuga was like the frat house of piracy, raucous, overcrowded, and perpetually drunk. They attacked Spanish ships, raided coastal towns, and lived in this strange democracy. Captains were elected. Loot was shared according to agreed rules. Injuries even came with compensation. Lose an arm? Here's some silver. Lose an eye? Smaller payout, but still something. In a world where regular sailors got whipped for sneezing too loud, pirate crews actually looked kind of progressive. By the late 1600s, piracy exploded. Some notable names drift in here. There's Henry Morgan. Yes, the rum brand guy. He started as a Welsh privateer, then went full buccaneer. He attacked Spanish Panama in 1671, looted it brutally, then somehow got pardoned, knighted, and made governor of Jamaica. Talk about failing upward. Imagine robbing a bank, then being appointed as mayor of the city you robbed. And this is the pattern we'll see over and over. Pirates terrorize the seas, governments complain, then quietly hire the same pirates when it suits them. Because colonial politics were basically a never-ending group project, with everyone cheating off each other. Now, as we glide into the early 1700s, piracy gets its Hollywood glow-up. This is the Golden Age proper. The era of Blackbeard, Calico Jack, and Bonny, Mary Red, and all the rest. But before we meet them, let's set the stage. Europe had just wrapped up the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714. Don't worry, you don't need to memorize treaties. Just know that when wars end, soldiers and sailors get dumped on the job market. Thousands of hardened seamen suddenly had no paycheck, no ship, and no idea what to do. And conveniently, there were still plenty of fat, slow merchant ships floating around. Sox sailors, ex-privateers, and basically anyone who hated authority found themselves slipping into piracy. They created what was almost a parallel society. Pirate ships ran on vote. Captains could be deposed. Loot was divided. And compared to the miserable life of a regular sailor, cramped, underpaid, whipped for nothing, piracy looked, well, tempting. Let's pause here and appreciate the irony. Governments painted pirates as savage, lawless villains. But many pirates were escaping from governments that treated them like disposable trash. On a pirate ship, you had a say. You got a share. You even got a say in punishment. Meanwhile, the Royal Navy just threw you into the rigging until you dropped. So yeah, if you were a sailor in 1715, piracy wasn't just crime. It was oddly democratic crime. And that, my friends, is where we'll leave part 1. We've drifted from the Spanish treasure fleets to barbecue buccaneers, to the disgruntled ex-sailors brewing into full-blown pirates. Next time, we'll slide right into the infamous names. Blackbeard, Calico Jack, the women who refused to sit quietly, and the ultimate downfall of piracy as an institution. But for now, close your eyes. Picture the creak of wooden ships, the salt air, the faint sound of drunken singing from Tortuga. And drift, part 2, Blackbeard and friends. Alright, welcome back, sleepy crew. Let's pick up where we left off. The Caribbean around 1715 was basically a job fair for pirates. Thousands of sailors just kind of shrugged and said, well, I guess crime pays now. Out of that chaotic stew, a few names floated to the top. And we should probably start with the poster child of piracy, Edward Teach. Or Thatch. Or maybe Drummond. Honestly, nobody's sure. But the world remembers him as Blackbeard. Now, Blackbeard has one of those reputations that's bigger than life. He's the guy every Halloween costume is based on. The one with fire in his beard, storm clouds in his eyes, and apparently a flair for theatricality. Here's the reality. He was tall. He had a big black beard. And he leaned hard into branding. He figured out early that terror works better than gunpowder. So before battles, he stuck lit fuses under his hat, making his head literally smoke. Imagine seeing a giant man with burning wires spitting sparks out of his hair, holding swords in both hands and glaring at you. Would you fight or just politely hand over your cargo? Yeah. Most ships surrendered on sight. The funny part? Blackbeard wasn't even that violent. He cultivated the image of a monster, so he didn't actually have to kill that many people. It's like the world's first marketing campaign, except instead of selling sneakers, he sold pure terror. Now, Blackbeard's career highlights. In 1717, he captured a French slave ship and upgraded it into his flagship, Queen Anne's Revenge. Great name, by the way. Nothing says political statement like naming your ship after a deposed monarch. He crammed it with 40 cannons, because apparently subtlety wasn't his thing. He blockaded Charleston, South Carolina, holding the entire port hostage for a week. Not for jewels. He just wanted medicine, which is almost wholesome in a pirate-wise sort of way. But like all pirate stories, his ended badly. In 1718, the governor of Virginia decided enough was enough. He sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard to hunt him down. They cornered Blackbeard at Ocracoke, North Carolina. There was a brutal fight. Well, brutal by sleepy history standards, and Blackbeard supposedly took 5 gunshot wounds and 20 sword cuts before falling. Honestly, if true, the man was basically a boss battle. And then, just for dramatic flair, they chopped off his head and hung it on the bow of Maynard's ship, because apparently subtle messaging was a lost art. But Blackbeard wasn't the only pirate making waves. Let's talk about Calico Jack Rackham. Now, if Blackbeard was the scary face of piracy, Calico Jack was the fashion blogger. He got his nickname because he liked wearing brightly patterned calico clothes, which is cute, but not exactly terrifying. He wasn't known for epic sea battles or massive treasure. He's mostly remembered because of his crew, specifically 2 of his crewmates, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Anne Bonny was Irish, born around 1697, daughter of a lawyer and his maid, which already sounds like a scandalous soap opera setup. Her family moved to South Carolina, where Anne grew up with a temper described as fiery. Translation: she stabbed a guy once. Classic teenage rebellion. She married a small-time sailor, James Bonny, but quickly got bored. Then she met Calico Jack and decided piracy was more fun than domestic life. She ran off with him, disguised herself as a man on deck, and joined the crew. Enter Mary Red. She was English, raised in disguise as a boy because her mother wanted to trick her dead husband's mother into giving them money. Which is complicated family drama, but hey, it worked. Mary kept dressing as a man, even joined the army at one point, and eventually found herself on a ship that Calico Jack captured. She decided, why not, and joined his crew too. So here we have Anne Bonny and Mary Read. 2 women dressed as men, sailing with Calico Jack, and out-pirating most of the men on board. When their true identities came out, the crew was apparently shocked. But impressed. There's a famous story that during their final battle in 1720, when their ship was attacked, most of the male crew hid below deck. And Anne Mary, on the other hand, fought fiercely on deck, cursing the cowards who wouldn't fight. Which is both badass and slightly hilarious. Eventually, they were captured, tried in Jamaica, and sentenced to hang. Calico Jack was executed. But Anne and Mary both claimed pregnancy, which under English law delayed execution. Mary did actually die in prison, probably of fever, and, well, she kind of disappears from the record. Some think her father bailed her out. Some think she lived quietly under a new identity. Either way, her pirate career ended, but her legend lived on. While we're here, let's sprinkle in a few other pirate names. There's Charles Vane, known mostly for being cruel and unreliable. He was the kind of guy who'd rather burn a ship than capture it properly. His crew eventually got tired of his antics, voted him out, and left him stranded on a small island, which is the pirate equivalent of being unfriended on Facebook, but much harsher. There's Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart. Now here's the ironic part. Roberts wasn't really into piracy at first. He got captured, reluctantly joined, and then somehow became one of the most successful pirates of all time. He captured over 400 ships in just a few years. And he did it all while dressed in fancy red clothes, with a feathered hat, sipping tea like he was at a garden party. Pirates loved theatrics, apparently. So what was daily life like on a pirate ship? Surprisingly organized. Ships ran on pirate codes, written agreements about loot, discipline, and compensation. Captains weren't dictators. They were elected. Crews could vote them out. Loot was divided in shares, with captains maybe taking 2 shares, quartermasters 1.5, and everyone else 1. Injuries got payouts. Lose a leg, get 600 pieces of 8. Which, honestly, sounds better than modern health insurance. And despite the popular image, parrots and buried treasure were not really a thing. Pirates wanted quick spending money. They blew their loot on rum, food, and let's just say local entertainment. When broke, they'd go back to sea and do it all again. But governments weren't thrilled about this freewheeling democracy at sea. Piracy disrupted trade, scared merchants, and made colonial governors look incompetent. By the 1720s, Britain especially decided enough was enough. They sent warships, offered pardons, and cracked down hard. Many pirates accepted royal pardons. Others refused, like Blackbeard and Charles Vane, and were hunted down. By the mid-1720s, the so-called Golden Age was all. Let's float back to Anne Bonny for just a second. After Calico Jack's execution, legend says she told him, "If you had fought like a man, you wouldn't be hanged like a dog," which is both cold and poetic. A fitting line to close out the Golden Age's most colorful characters. So here we are, around 1725. Most of the famous pirates are dead, captured, or retired. The Caribbean starts calming down. The Wild West at sea fades into memory. But don't close your eyes yet, we're not done. Because piracy didn't just vanish. It shifted. West Africa, the Indian Ocean, and even the South China Sea had their own waves of pirate. And European empires, well, they kept quietly supporting piracy when it was convenient. But that's for the next part. And that, gentle listeners, is part 2. We've drifted with Blackbeard, met the pirate fashionista Calico Jack, admired Anne and Mary's ferocity, and watched piracy's glow slowly dim. For now, relax. Let the waves carry you into sleep. And when you're ready, in part 3 we'll follow piracy as it spreads beyond the Caribbean, into Africa and Asia, until governments finally, sort of, get a handle on it. Part 3. From the Caribbean to the wider world. Alright, settle back in. We've had our rum with Blackbeard, endured Calico Jack's questionable fashion choices, and admired Anne Bonny and Mary Read for being infinitely tougher than most of their crewmate. But the story doesn't stop in the Caribbean. Because piracy, like an inconvenient rash, tends to spread. By the 1720s, the Caribbean was getting crowded with warships, governors, and, worst of all, paperwork. Britain, France, and Spain were actually trying, for once, to cooperate against piracy. Which meant the fun was ending. So pirates did what pirates do best. They looked for new places to steal stuff. And conveniently, the world had plenty. Let's drift over to West Africa first. The African coast. Why Africa? One word, trade. The West African coast was central to the transatlantic slave trade. Ships sailed from Europe, loaded with goods like guns, cloth, and alcohol. They exchanged these for enslaved Africans. Then ships crossed the Atlantic, the infamous Middle Passage, carrying human cargo to the Americas. Finally, they returned to Europe with sugar, tobacco, and coffee. It was called the triangular trade. And if you're picturing it as a triangle, yes, exactly that. Except instead of geometry homework, it was brutal human exploitation. Pirates saw opportunity here. Slave ships were often lightly defended, packed with supplies, and ripe for capture. And just like in the Caribbean, enslaved people sometimes joined pirate crews when freed. Pirate ships could become bizarrely diverse micro-societies. Outcasts from England, escaped Africans, indigenous sailors, all thrown together in one floating democracy. One notorious pirate in this region was Howell Davis, a Welshman who operated off West Africa around 1719. He was clever rather than brutal, preferring tricks to outright bloodshed. He once pretended to be a legitimate naval captain, waltzed into a fort, and then, surprise, took it over. Pirates, masters of the long con. Another was Bartholomew Roberts, whom we met briefly last time. He really hit his stride off Africa. Roberts, aka Blackbeard, became arguably the most successful pirate ever. Over 400 ships captured, which is a wild career tally, considering most pirates barely lasted a year before being caught. Roberts was peculiar. Unlike your rum-soaked stereotype, he didn't drink much. He was deeply religious, wore fine clothes, and ran his ship with strict discipline. Basically, he was the pirate equivalent of that overachieving classmate who ruins the grading curve. His men loved him, though, because he brought results. But even Roberts couldn't outrun the Empire forever. In 1722, the Royal Navy caught up with him off the coast of Gabon. He was killed in battle, supposedly with a grape shot to the throat. His crew wrapped his body in sailcloth and tossed it into the sea before capture, because even in death, pirates preferred freedom over display on a gallows. With Roberts gone, piracy off Africa took a nosedive. He had been the last big figure keeping the scene alive. Without him, the Indian Ocean adventures, but don't worry, the story doesn't end there. Let's sail east, to the Indian Ocean. Now, the Indian Ocean had long been a bustling trade zone. Spices, silks, jewels, and all the luxury goods Europe drooled over came through here. And where there's wealth, there are, you guessed it, pirates. Enter the Pirates of Madagascar. Yes, before it was an animated DreamWorks movie with dancing lemurs, Madagascar was actually a pirate haven. Here's how it happened. Some pirates in the 1690s got tired of the Caribbean heat and the increasing number of hangings. They sailed around Africa and discovered Madagascar, strategically placed along the East Indies trade routes, rich in supplies, and most importantly, far away from European naval patrols. Perfect. The island became a hub, with little pirate settlements and bases. Imagine Tortuga 2.0, just with more lemurs. One of the most infamous Indian Ocean pirates was Henry Avery, also called Avery. He was English, started as a mutineer in 1694, and pulled off one of the most famous pirate heists ever, the capture of the Mughal treasure ship Ganj Isawai. Now, picture this. The Mughal Empire was at its peak, ruling most of India. The Ganj Isawai was a massive, heavily armed ship carrying pilgrims returning from Mecca, along with mountains of treasure. Avery's small pirate fleet somehow managed to take it. The loot? Gold, silver, jewels, worth what would be tens of millions today. It was, of course, a diplomatic disaster. The Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb was furious. He shut down English trading posts in retaliation, threatening England's entire East India Company venture. The English crown suddenly realized, oh no, maybe letting random guys pirate wasn't the best foreign policy. Avery disappeared after this heist. Some say he retired rich. Others claim he died poor, scammed by his own associate. Either way, he became a legend. The Pirate King, they called him. But his success also triggered one of the first global manhunt. England put a price on his head, sending word across Europe, Africa, and Asia, which, in a way, made him the world's first internationally wanted man. Congratulations, Henry. Another notable pirate in the Indian Ocean was William Kidd. Captain Kidd is interesting because he didn't actually want to be a pirate. He was hired as a privateer by the English to hunt other pirates. But along the way, things got messy. His crew mutinied, he captured the wrong ships, and suddenly, oops, he was branded a pirate himself. Kidd sailed around Madagascar, took some prizes, and eventually went back to New York to plead his innocence. Spoiler, it didn't work. He was arrested, shipped to London, and hanged in 1701. His body was tarred and hung in chains by the River Thames as a warning, which is just the kind of cheerful bedtime image we love. Why the Golden Age faded so? By the 1720s, the party was winding down everywhere. Why? A few reasons. First, governments finally got serious. Britain especially realized that pirates weren't just a nuisance, they were bad for business. Trade was the empire's lifeline, and you can't run an empire if every merchant ship is being hijacked by some guy named Calico Jack. Second, pardons. Colonial governors started offering amnesty to pirates who surrendered. Many did. Better to live quietly in the Bahamas than dangle from a noose in London. Third, the rise of stronger navies. The Royal Navy expanded, patrolling key routes, and using faster ships better suited to chase pirates. Technology and resources shifted in favor of governments. And finally, pirates themselves were their own worst enemy. They were too visible, too disruptive, and too fragmented to ever form lasting power. No pirate king, no pirate nation, just scattered ships briefly united, then gone. The legacy of pirate democracy. Here's the fun part though. Even as the Golden Age faded, the myth grew. Pirates became folk heroes, especially in contrast to the rigid, unfair world most people lived in. Sailors back then were treated like garbage. Starvation, disease, and endless discipline were normal. On a pirate ship, you got a vote. You got a share. You got, dare I say it, something like dignity. Of course, it wasn't paradise. Life expectancy was short. Disease was rampant. And the whole system was built on theft and violence. But compared to life under the thumb of a navy captain or a plantation owner, piracy. That's why, even after most real pirates were gone, stories about them lingered. Ballads, plays, later novels. Pirates became symbols of freedom, rebellion, and adventure. Their reality was squalid, but their legend was irresistible, and so, by the mid-1700s, the so-called Golden Age of Piracy was over. The hangings had been carried out. The ships had been sunk. The survivors had either retired or disappeared into obscurity. But the image, the black flag, the Jolly Roger, the flamboyant captains with questionable grooming choices, that stayed. It stuck in the cultural imagination so firmly that centuries later, we still can't let it go. And, honestly, maybe that's the true treasure they left behind. Not gold, not jewels, but a mythology that still makes us sit up, or in this case, lie down, and listen. So that's where we'll pause, drifting at the edge of piracy's golden age, from the barbecue buccaneers of Tortuga to the theatrics of Blackbeard, the daring of Anne Bonny and Mary Red, the riches of Henry Every, and the discipline of Bartholomew Roberts. All of it burned bright, then fizzled, leaving behind more stories than ships. Now you can close your eyes, let the waves quiet down, and know that the Golden Age of Piracy was short, messy, and doomed, but unforgettable. We'll finish in Part 4 by floating into how piracy morphed in later centuries, and why our modern image of pirates owes more to writers and movies than to reality. For now, just rest. Part 4. The long afterlife of piracy. They were hanged at Execution Dock, left swaying for days in chains as a warning to all who passed the Thames. Their bodies were dumped into unmarked graves. Their ships rotted away, their treasure melted down into coins. And yet, somehow, the pirates did not die, because even after the gallows silenced their voices, they continued to live, on parchment, in novels, in theater halls, in paintings, in cinema, in the imagination of children whispering stories under candlelight. This is the long afterlife of piracy. The journey of criminals who became legends, monsters who became heroes, and history that turned into myth. Point 1. Pirates in literature, from villains to romantic rebels, the first wave of pirate storytelling did not paint them as lovable rogues. Early writers like Daniel Defoe, yes, the same man who gave us Robinson Crusoe, wrote accounts of men like Captain Kidd and Blackbeard that mixed fact with fiction. Defoe's A General History of the Pirates, 1724, was half history, half entertainment. It presented pirates as terrifying yet fascinating characters, men who defied kings and carved their own kingdoms at sea. And here is where the transformation began, because while real pirates murdered and plundered, the page allowed them to become something else. Symbols of defiance. By the Romantic period of the 19th century, poets and novelists had recast them as tragic figures. Take Lord Byron's The Corsair, 1814. His pirate hero, Conrad, wasn't a dirty, lice-ridden sea wolf. He was brooding, misunderstood, almost noble. The public loved it. The poem sold 10,000 copies on its first day of release. Why? Because piracy offered the ultimate fantasy, a life outside society's rules. A man untamed, a rebel who refused chains. And in an age when Europe was bound by strict social codes, pirates were the intoxicating dream of freedom. Point 2. The Victorian obsession, treasure maps, and buried gold. By the late 1800s, piracy had become firmly planted in the world of children's literature and adventure stories. And the man who sealed it forever was Robert Louis Stevenson, Treasure Island, 1883. Think of how many clichés we owe to this single novel. The one-legged sailor with a parrot on his shoulder. A treasure maps marked with an X. A buried gold waiting on remote islands. The sea shanty, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. Stevenson's pirate, Long John Silver, was no ordinary villain. He was cunning, charismatic, capable of cruelty but also oddly likable. The Victorian reader, especially young boys, devoured it. And suddenly, piracy was no longer about fear. It was about adventure. From then on, the pirate was split into two. The historical pirate, brutal, desperate, violent. The literary pirate, bold, witty, romantic, and guess which version survived in the popular. 3. Hollywood's pirates, swashbucklers, and shadows enter the 20th century, and the silver screen took the pirate myth to dazzling new heights. Hollywood loved swashbucklers, dashing men with swords in their teeth, leaping from rigging, rescuing damsels, dueling under the moon. Actors like Douglas Fairbanks and Errol Flynn practically invented the cinematic pirate in films like Captain Blood, 1935, and The Sea Hawk, 1940. And then there was the accent. You know the one, ARR matey. Believe it or not, that stereotype was born in 1950, when Disney released Treasure Island. Actor Robert Newton, who played Long John Silver, exaggerated his native West Country English accent. Children loved it. It stuck. And suddenly, every pirate in popular culture spoke in that exaggerated growl. But cinema didn't just exaggerate the pirate, it purified him. On screen, pirates rarely slaughtered civilians or sold people into slavery. Instead, they became adventurers, rebels against tyranny, lovable rogues. Hollywood had given pirates something they never had in real life, a conscience. Point 4. Pirates become icons from flags to festivals. By the late 20th century, pirates had escaped books and films and entered everyday culture. Think about the Jolly Roger, the skull and crossbones flag. Originally a tool of terror, designed to make merchant crews surrender without a fight, it is now everywhere. On t-shirts, coffee mugs, video games, even sports teams. There's Talk Like a Pirate Day, celebrated every September. Festivals in coastal towns where families dress up in bandanas and eye patches. And of course, Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean theme park ride, 1967, which in turn spawned one of the most successful film franchises of the 21st century. Johnny Depp's Captain Jack Sparrow is perhaps the most famous pirate of modern times, slippery, funny, unpredictable. And while Sparrow is fictional, his spirit carries echoes of Blackbeard and Calico Jack, but softened for modern taste. Today, pirates are not feared. They're adored. Point 5. The psychology of the pirate myth. But here's the question, why do we still love them? Why do criminals from 300 years ago continue to haunt and inspire us? The answer lies in what pirates symbolize. Freedom. Pirates represent life without laws, borders, or taxes, a fantasy of total escape, rebellion. They challenge kings, empires, and navies. They refuse to bow or romance. Their world is exotic islands, hidden coves, treasure, danger, and mystery. Identity. Dressing as a pirate lets us escape our modern roles, worker, student, citizen, and taste, even for a day, a wilder self. In short, pirates live in our imagination because they embody the parts of ourselves we're not allowed to live out in reality. Point 6. The dark reminder. But let's not forget the truth. The real Golden Age pirates were not Captain Jack Sparrow. They were men who slit throats, burned ships, and trafficked enslaved people. Their lives were often short, brutal, and ugly, and yet, maybe that's the paradox that makes the myth so powerful, because the gap between who they really were and who we want them to be is precisely where imagination thrives. The pirate becomes a mirror, a reflection of our own hunger for freedom, but also a warning about where unchained greed and violence can lead us. When we read Treasure Island, or hear a child shout, "R," or see a Jolly Roger flying from a festival mast, we're not just celebrating a cartoon character, we're keeping alive a centuries-old myth born from fear, polished by poets, magnified by Hollywood, and reimagined for every new generation. The pirates themselves are long gone, buried in forgotten graves, their ships broken and scattered on the ocean floor. But their afterlife is longer than their lives ever were, because as long as humans dream of escape, rebellion, and treasure, the pirate will never